Welcome. So my name is Dr. Milanovich, and I'm a professor at Loyola University Chicago. I'm here today to talk about amphibians and discuss amphibians with you. First, what I want to do is give a round of applause to all the attendees and all the supporters of this. This is really great. It's a truly an honor to be involved in this as well. So what I'd like to do is just tell you a bit about myself, and then I will go through a presentation that you all should be seeing right now. And throughout the way, if you just want to ask questions, go ahead and type them in, and I'll go through as best as I can as I'm going through my talk. And then we usually have some time at the end as well to do this. So I had a really unorthodox way of getting into studying amphibians. I grew up in the Detroit area, and I had really not a whole lot of nature around me when I was growing up, so I wasn't really exposed to it a lot. And I eventually got into college, and I went to a small school called Adrian College. It's a liberal arts college in Michigan, and that's where I really started getting more of an interest in biology in general. And one of my professors there actually studied reptiles and amphibians, so I started studying those in college a little bit. And then I went on to work with them a bit in college in a few different areas and just fell in love with reptiles and amphibians. So I started pursuing my career becoming a herpetologist, and I went to grad school in Arkansas and then in Georgia, and I eventually landed here at Loyola. So at Loyola, I teach a bunch of classes. I teach ecology and conservation biology and a class just on vertebrates where we cover a lot of reptiles and amphibians. And my research here really, most of it really encompasses studying reptiles and amphibians in their natural habitats. And I look at how things that humans do, like destruct the land and add pollutants in the environment, climate change. I look at how all those things impact reptiles and amphibians. So today we're going to focus mostly on amphibians. And what I'll start doing is just kind of going through this talk. And again, if you have any questions, just let me know, and I can pause after each slide and kind of take what questions are there. And then again, we'll have some questions at the end. So let's talk about amphibians a bit. So amphibians are a vertebrate, and even though they are really diverse, where we have about almost 8,000 species globally, and new ones keep getting described every year, most of them are made up of frogs and toads. And they make up about 80 or so, 90 or so percent of amphibians on Earth. Then you have this other section, which are newts and salamanders, and those make up about 700 or so species. And then in the tropics and some other areas, you have what are called caecilians, and they basically look like little snakes, so they don't have any legs, but they are actually an amphibian. And the really cool thing about amphibians is that they've been on Earth for about 300 or so million years, are the first amphibians that evolved. And even some of the species that are around today have relatives that were around that long ago. So what's unique about that is if you think about how long ago that was, the Earth not only was really different in terms of its habitat and what it looked like, but dinosaurs came and went. So whatever happened to the dinosaurs, we know that it was this big asteroid impact and it changed the Earth quite a bit. We also see the reptiles and amphibians actually lived through that, and they were able to survive whatever the dinosaurs couldn't survive. So I think it makes them really special. We'll talk about all the cool things about amphibians and all their different types of them, and then we'll go through what is hurting them right now. They're in a lot of trouble. So if you want to learn more about amphibians, there's a really neat website, and I put it up here in the PowerPoint. It's called AmphibiaWeb, and this will tell you all about amphibians, especially amphibians in North America. The map I'm showing you here is a map of the diversity of amphibians. And really what that means is just the number of species of amphibians in each of these countries. And you can see very clearly that if you are a country along the equator, then you have a higher number of species of amphibians than other countries. And you see South America and parts of Asia have quite a few. North America, we have a good amount as well. But once you get north of it, where it gets too cold, then you don't see a lot of species. And we'll talk about why that is. One thing I want to note is that one of the coolest amphibians I think exists is called the patch-nose salamander. And this is a salamander right here. And this is actually one that's really special to me because I actually helped to find this salamander, describe it to science. So before 2007, this salamander was not known to scientists at all. And a friend of mine and a colleague of mine, Bill Peterman, who is now at Ohio State, actually was working with me in Georgia, and he found this little animal here. So the one that you're seeing here is an actually adult female, and she has eggs in her belly. And if you look close, what you can see is that she is sitting on top of a dime. And if you think about how small a dime is, then you can get a sense of exactly how small this salamander is. It's actually one of the smallest salamanders in the world, and they have a bunch of cool attributes. Their home range is really small. So where they live on Earth is only a couple square miles. And this salamander is really unique because it has some special traits. And the first one is that it's lungless. So the salamander has no lungs. And this is not unique to salamanders. There's a big group that live in North America and in South America and a few species in Asia that actually lost their lungs. So they breathe entirely through their skin. Now, most amphibians breathe through their skin in some way, but this little guy and his relatives, that's all they can do is breathe through their skin. So this salamander, we call it the patch-nose salamander, and you can see the little patch on her nose. And she lives in the small area in Georgia, and she lays her eggs in water, and her babies hatch out in the water, and they grow up, and then they go through what's called metamorphosis, which a lot of amphibians do. And then they live on land the rest of their time, as far as we know. So what's cool about amphibians, aside from the patch-nose salamander, which I think is the coolest, they are really diverse. So there's lots and lots of species of amphibians. And in North America in particular, we have quite a few species. But what's also unique about amphibians is that where you find them, there's usually a lot of them. So they're abundant. And that's a really unique trait with amphibians in general being a vertebrate, but it just means that there's a lot of them where they are, and there's also a lot of species in some areas as well. And some of my research actually studies this. So what you're looking at in the bottom right there is a salamander called the slimy salamander, and they're called that because they actually slime you when you pick them up. And it gets to the point where your hands can be so sticky that they can stick together. So that's a big defense mechanism for this animal. And this animal is really unique because it again has no lungs, and it lives in the forest, lives just on the forest floor its whole life. It doesn't lay eggs in water or anything. And a few colleagues of mine, we looked at the salamander species and others, and we compared how many salamanders there were, and then how much biomass that made up. So if you look at how many there are and how much they weigh, what we showed is that there's not only more salamanders in the forest, but they actually weigh more than all of the birds in the forest, and then also all the mammals. So even deer. So even though these salamanders are just about the size of your finger, there's so many of them that they actually can outweigh the biomass of deer and birds. So they're really unique in that sense where if you go out into a forest that has these lungless salamanders, you might find 4 or 5 per square meter, which is about the size of a couple school desks put together. So there's just a lot of these animals around. And there's a number of studies that have looked at this and showed that there's the amount of biomass on Earth as amphibians is really impressive. The other cool thing about amphibians is that they are really diverse in terms of where they live. So what we know is that amphibians can live just on land. We talked about those salamanders with no lungs, and they do just fine. They need to live in these cool, moist environments. but there's also salamanders and other frogs and toads and other amphibians that live in the water and on land. And that's what we call biphasic. It just means they have two parts to their life cycle. So these amphibians a lot of times will either lay eggs in water, or they'll lay eggs in treetops and they fall in the water, and then their little babies will grow up in the water, and then they'll complete metamorphosis and go live on land for part of their life. Another neat thing is that amphibians are what are called poikilothermic. Now, you may think of that as cold-blooded, but their blood isn't actually cold. What actually happens is that just means that their blood and their body basically is only heated up by the environment. So whatever the environmental temperature is what these amphibians' temperature is. And that's what we call poikilothermy or ectothermy. So they're really unique in that sense. And if you think about that map I showed, that's why you don't see a lot of amphibians in really, really cold environments, because it's hard for them to live. So here's a life cycle of an amphibian that is biphasic. So you can see that there's this adult frog. The adult frog will lay their eggs. In this case, they're laying it on a leaf, and the tadpoles will then hatch out and drop in the water, or they can hatch out right in the water. And then that grows up for a few months, sometimes longer, and it turns into what's called a little froglet. And that froglet is still kind of hanging out in the water, but doesn't quite want to live on land yet. And eventually it'll metamorph in a couple weeks, and it'll go live on land for the rest of its life. You also see some salamanders do this too. Some salamanders have this biphasic life cycle as well, where they'll lay eggs on land or in the water, and then they'll metamorph into land. And some of those are really cool, where they actually stay in the water the whole time. Those are called paedomorphic salamanders. So they'll lay eggs in the water, but they'll never leave the water to turn into a salamander that lives on land. They'll stay in the water the whole time, which is pretty cool. And then you have this third group, which I've talked about, which are these salamanders that don't have any lungs. And that makes up most of the amphibians that live on land totally and never visit water, but not all the amphibians that do this are lungless. But this one here is another slimy salamander, and you can see that this mom here actually does something really cool that is unique to just a few amphibian species, where she will lay her eggs, and this is in an old mine shaft that I used to work at, and she wraps herself around these eggs and she'll protect them. She'll not only protect them from other salamanders eating them, but snakes, and she actually keeps all the bacteria off of them, and she keeps them moist, and she'll actually do this until they hatch. So she'll stay in this mine shaft, or usually it's underground in a log or in a rock crevice or in the soil, where she will take care of these eggs until they hatch, and she won't eat the entire time. She won't leave their side for several months, which is pretty cool. So let's move on to some questions. The first one is, what is the fastest amphibian? And the best answer to that is probably thinking about amphibian species that live in the water, because they can move really fast through the water. Now, amphibians on land are sometimes fast, and it's kind of hard to gauge how fast they are, but you see a lot of these salamanders and some frogs that want to get to a wetland really fast, and they can move pretty fast. But I would say the ones that live in the water, they're probably the fastest for the shortest amount of time. So they can really swim through the water pretty fast. The second question is if I have any amphibians as pets myself, and I don't personally, but a lot of friends of mine have a lot of amphibians and reptiles for pets as well. And they make good pets because they actually are really easy to take care of. You just have to make sure that you get it from the right source. So never take an amphibian from the wild or nature and bring it back to your house for very long. So one more question is, what is the longest amphibian? And I think the answer to that is that the longest one is called the giant salamander. And it's called that for a reason. They live in China, in Japan, and in parts of Asia, and they could be up to 6 feet long. They're that big. They're a salamander. They live in big streams and rivers, and they do have lungs, these guys, They're really, really long and really big, and they're by far the longest salamander on Earth. Another cool thing about amphibians is that they have permeable skin. All that means is that their skin has a bunch of holes in it. And what that allows them to do is for them to breathe. So a lot of salamanders and frogs actually have lungs, but they'll also breathe through their skin. So if their skin is nice and moist, they can take the oxygen that's in water and actually pass it through their skin and capture the oxygen that way. So even though they have lungs, they can still use their skin to breathe. What it also does, though, is make them kind of susceptible. It makes them a little bit tougher to live in these environments that might be toxic. So if any pollutants are in the environment or any type of toxins, then it can get into their skin really easily. And that's one of the ways that we see amphibians are being hurt a lot by what humans are doing to the earth, is that they're living in these environments that historically didn't have a lot of toxins in it, but humans might be adding them in. And it makes amphibians a pretty decent, what's called an indicator species. So if something is wrong with the amphibians, then that really highlights that something might be wrong with that environment. And it could be that there's some toxins in the environment. So the other question here is, what are the main differences between amphibians and reptiles? And there's a couple key differences, and it all really stems from the way these organisms evolved throughout their history. So millions of years ago, amphibians and reptiles shared a somewhat common ancestor, but the way they evolved after that, we see was very, very different. So the first thing that differed was that amphibians don't have an egg that is shelled. So amphibians, almost all of their eggs are like little packets of jelly, basically. And then that diverged from a group long, long time ago that started making eggs that were shelled, that had a hard shell on them or some sort of casing on them. And that group of organisms that started creating these eggs with shells turned into what we call reptiles today and birds. So actually, we see that playing out a little different, where turtles are something really different than basically everything. Crocodiles are really closely related to birds, and then you see lizards and snakes are pretty closely related to birds and pretty closely related to crocodiles, and then also turtles as well. But turtles and crocodiles and lizards and snakes are all really different from amphibians. And the main difference is that they have this kind of casing on their eggs. What's also different is that most reptiles, if not all reptiles, have a really hard or scaly body. So their skin isn't permeable. They don't have holes in their skin, so to speak. So there's a lot of differences in terms of how these species evolved, or how these groups of organisms evolved. But it just so happens that in about the 1600s or so, we started seeing similarities in how amphibians and reptiles lived. So that's why we study them all together. Even though they're very different from each other and they evolve very differently, we see that they are just studied together because they live in similar habitats and they have some similar characteristics in how they live. But they're actually really, really different organisms. So before I get to some more questions, I just want to note that amphibians are really in trouble. So what we're seeing today is that amphibians are going extinct at a really fast rate. And if you look at this graph here, what it shows you is across the several millions and millions of years, we've shown that we've had these events on Earth where a lot of species have gone extinct at once. And these are called mass extinction events. And they sometimes can take thousands of years to happen, but across millions of years, it's really a short time frame. So across history, what we've seen so far that we know of is that there have been 5 times in history where all species have really gone extinct really fast, and we call these mass extinction events. It just means that the rate at which species are going extinct, how many go extinct per year, was a lot faster than it normally is. And what we're seeing now today is that amphibians and other species are undergoing a sixth mass extinction. And unlike the historic ones that used to happen, the mass extinction today is caused by humans and what humans are doing to the earth. And beforehand, all the other mass extinctions were when humans weren't on Earth. So we know that other factors were at play, and a lot of that was climate related. The asteroid impact was one of them. So we see a lot of these differences happening and why animals go extinct. Today, what we know is that amphibians and other animals are going extinct because of humans. So we'll talk about this in a bit, but I wanted to get to a couple more questions here. One of them is, what is the most deadly amphibian to humans? And that is undoubtedly this group of frogs that live in South America, and they're called the poison dart frogs. They live in Central South America, and they actually do a really unique thing. They eat a lot of ants, and these ants have a toxin in them. These frogs then can accumulate that toxin, and it basically permeates through their skin. So they're really brightly colored, and they're toxic as well. And what they're trying to tell predators is that don't eat me, I'm toxic. But undoubtedly, they're the most toxic amphibians on Earth, are these poison dart frogs. So the next question is it true that salamanders regrow tails and legs? And that is actually true. A lot of salamander species can regrow all their limbs, even if you cut it off. And that's something that's called regeneration. And it's really unique, and it's very cool, and it's starting to be studied a lot, but it is actually true. So let's go ahead and start talking about the reason why amphibians are going extinct and undergoing this mass extinction event. So again, currently, what we know is that about a third of amphibians, so about 30 or so % of all amphibians that are on Earth today are at risk of going extinct. So it's not quite half, but it's very close to half the amphibians on Earth aren't just in trouble in terms of their populations, but the entire species is at risk of going extinct. And if we look at something called the background extinction rate, that's that rate at which we expect that species will go extinct on just for natural causes that happen on Earth. And what we're seeing today is that the rate at which amphibians are going extinct is thousands and thousands times faster than what we normally would expect it to happen. So that's why we're really worried about amphibians and why we're characterizing this as a mass extinction event. And what we know of today is that at least over 168 species have gone extinct in the past 20 years. And this number is really hard to quantify because to actually measure if an animal has gone extinct, you have to study it over and over and over to make sure that there are no individuals left. And then it has to go through this big review process, and this takes years to happen. So we suspect that this number is going to keep going up and up once we really truly confirm that a lot of these organisms that we think are extinct are actually extinct. But this is a number, about 170 so we know are actually extinct. And there's many, many more amphibians that are we think are extinct, and we're just not quite sure yet, but we're pretty positive. So here's some of the reasons why amphibians are going extinct. And I wanted to take some time and talk about each of these separately. And then what we can do is actually open it up to questions even more. So the 5 reasons are number 1, and this is really, I would say, in order of what's really impacting them most. For the most part, it kind of depends on where you are. But I would say undoubtedly the number 1 reason amphibians are going extinct is because of habitat destruction. The places that they live, we are absolutely just devastating them. We're cutting down forests, we're drying up wetlands, we're changing habitats. We are basically fragmenting habitats in smaller areas. And all this combined is called habitat destruction, and that is causing amphibians to go extinct pretty fast. We also see that there's a lot of diseases that are occurring. We see pollutants in the environment. Remember I talked about the skin of amphibians being really, really holy, and pollutants and other toxins can get in their skin. We also, we know that global climate change is having some impact on amphibians, and we think that in the future that is going to have a pretty big impact on if they can survive or not really well. And the last one is this this idea that folks actually trade. They collect amphibians from the wild, and they raise them and basically capture them from the wild and never let them go. So we have this big pet trade concern with amphibians, and then also we have what's called over exploitation. It just means that people are taking them from the wild to eat them or for pet trades way too much. So we're going to go through each of these separately and discuss a little bit about these animals. So the first one is I want to talk about is habitat destruction. So this occurs in a couple different ways, and here's a few pictures of what's going on here. So what we're seeing on the left there is this landscape that is really variable. There's a lot of stuff going on there. There's a big patch of forest in the middle. There looks like there's some farms and some houses. And what historically this area was most likely like in the picture on the left was one big forest. So all the amphibians that lived in there were living in this one big forest. And once we start putting farms in there and urban areas, and we start cutting down that forest, what's happening is two things. We see that the forests are gone, so the places that the amphibians live are gone, but then the forests that are left are far away from other adjacent forests. So they're kind of isolating species. And some amphibian species really just need to have a lot of forest around them or a lot of similar types of habitat around them, even if it's not forest. So when you start fragmenting that landscape, you start breaking it up and chopping it up, then we see that it really impacts amphibians, not just because they don't have places to live, but they don't have a lot of similar areas around them where they can live. So it's a big issue having these habitats not connected really well to other ones. The other thing that we see is that there are a lot of new diseases that are impacting amphibians, and they're actually impacting them really strongly in the sense that it's caused a lot of amphibians to go extinct. The first one I want to talk about is called the chytrid fungus, and really what scientists call it is BD, and that's just a acronym for the species of fungus that's actually impacting these species. And this was found in the 1980s. And if you look at the map on the upper left right here, we see that it was in Central America. And it started in this kind of a western basin of Central America where we saw a lot of die-offs of amphibians. And we would see not just one or two here or there, but we would see hundreds and hundreds of animals dead in one site. And what we realized is that it was this fungus that was impacting the amphibian's skin. And it basically kind of plugs up their skin. And if they're babies in the water, it alters their mouth parts so they can't eat really well. And what we saw throughout 20 or so years, and it's even going on today, is that fungus started really far west in Central America. And throughout the years, you could see that it moved to the right. And it just started going eastward. So every year in the certain season, we would see that the fungus and this infection that was killing these amphibians was moving a little bit to the east, a little bit to the east, couple miles. And it kept doing this across several years. Along the way, what we saw were that a lot of amphibian species in Central America were getting impacted by this. And they were dying off, and it caused several extinctions in this area where it really devastated the amphibian populations there. Is real bad. The second one I want to talk about is called BSAL. This is another fungus, and so far what we know is that it affects almost exclusively salamanders, and it occurs in Europe right now. And so far, I think that's the only place we found it. There might be some reports otherwhere, but it's again a fungus that's pretty similar to the chytrid fungus, but definitely very different in the sense that it impacts salamanders mostly, whereas the chytrid fungus mostly impacts frogs, but it can infect any amphibians really. So we see this new fungal infection rising up, which is called B-sal, that's in Europe. The other one is called the ranavirus, and this ranavirus is something that's very different than the fungal infections because it's actual viral infection that amphibians can get. And this occurs in North America, and in most continents we see ranavirus occurring. Now, what's unique about all this stuff is that we know that amphibians have had diseases before, but what we're seeing is that they have just more diseases these days, or it seems as though the fungal infections and the viral infections that affect amphibians today are worse than what we knew before. And one of the big hypotheses about why this is happening is that the climate is changing. And as the climate changes and warms up, it alters the long-term conditions, and it can change these fungal infections and viral infections. And what we think is that it's doing a couple things, that it might actually be making these things more toxic than they normally are. Just the way that which these fungal and viral infections evolve is just a little bit faster or different in these warmer environments. So it's making them more toxic, more harmful. And it also might be that as the climate warms, it's just allowing these things to be more prevalent in the environment. So these toxins and the fungal infections and viral infections just seem to be more present in more areas because the climate is actually warming. So we see those as being really big concerns of why amphibians are in trouble. So let's get to a couple more questions. The first one here is, what is my favorite amphibian species? Mine is absolutely the patch-nosed salamander. That's the one that me and my colleagues found in Georgia. And if you go to the Amphibia website, you can type in patch-nosed salamander. You can read all about it, see all the cool pictures about it. The second question here is, what can we do to help prevent the declines in amphibian populations? And we could talk a bit more about this at the end if we want to, but there's a couple things you could do. I would say the first thing is we could, as humans, we can really try to stop cutting down forests, plant more trees. We can just really create more habitats for these amphibians. That's one big way we can do this. Create more wetlands, stop draining wetlands. We can connect habitats that are good for amphibians together. So if they're fragmented or far apart from each other, we can connect those with forest or wetland complexes. I think that's one major thing we can do. I think the other thing is we can really try to focus on stopping climate change and mitigating climate change, because we know that is impacting amphibians already, and we think it's going to impact them pretty bad in the future. The third thing I would say we can do is, basically try to minimize the impact on amphibians that are here today. So I think we can try to stop over collecting them and stop using them in ways that is not sustainable to use them. Okay, this other good question here is there any way to cure any of these diseases? And the short answer is that there isn't a really good way that can be applied really broadly right now. Now we're working on things really hard, and there's a lot of scientists that are finding ways that we can prevent the transfer of chytrid fungus and BD and B-sal, and there's some really great science going on that probably pretty soon will help a lot. But you have to remember that amphibians are really small, and there's a lot of them, and they live everywhere. So to try to prevent these diseases everywhere would be really tough. but there is a lot of scientists that are working on it, and they're making really big progress on trying to stop these diseases. So we have another question here, which is how does climate change affect how quickly diseases spread within the populations? And the short answer is it basically just allows these fungi or the viruses to be active more. So usually what happens is in colder environments, like here in Illinois, it's too cold in the wintertime for these infections to be present in the environment. They're just not active, or they actually go dormant. But as the climate warms, what it does is it makes the springs longer, it makes the summers longer, the winters shorter, and it lengthens the time that these diseases and what's causing them are able to impact amphibians. So the short answer is that it actually just kind of lengthens the time that these diseases are able to impact amphibians. But it also is a little bit more complicated. What we're seeing is that as the climate warms, we think that it actually helps to make some of these diseases and fungal infections worse. So they evolve differently to where they're more toxic in certain warmer environments than they are in certain colder environments. So we think it's kind of both of those things. Okay, so keep those questions coming as well. Another thing that we're seeing is that amphibians are impacted a lot by pollutants. And when you think about it, this makes a lot of sense because these animals have a lot of porous skin, so their skin can get exposed to these toxins, and it can go right into these animals and impact them in certain ways. And a lot of times what we see is that it impacts how these animals develop. So if you look at this frog here, this is a leopard frog, and you can see that there's some weird things going on with a few of these frogs. One of them is missing one of its legs. Another one grew an extra leg. And what's happening here is that if you look on the far right there, those are leopard frog eggs. So the eggs are in this environment here, and what can happen right away is that any adults or eggs that are in this water, if that water is toxic for some reason, let's say the landscape around it has pesticides on it, and it rains, those pesticides would then drain into this wetland or this pond where these frogs are breeding and hanging out. So if it gets in the water, then it can get really quickly into the skin. So it can impact the adult frogs, where it could be so bad where the adult frogs get killed from these toxins that are in the water. If it's not to that level where it kills adult frogs, then what you have with the eggs is that once they hatch, or even before they hatch, they're getting exposed to these toxins. And what we see there is that these pollutants oftentimes can impact how these frogs develop. So how they grow and how they metamorph and grow through time. And it basically alters the way that they develop, and that's why you get these salamanders that are missing a leg, is because that toxin, when the salamander was young and developing, stopped the growth of that leg. It altered how the development and the genetics of the development of these species. So we see things like this where you get frogs that are alive, but they have an extra leg or a missing leg, or they're deformed in some other way. So these toxins don't necessarily have to kill the amphibians right out directly, but a lot of times they can cause other impacts like this, where you get these big deformities, and that kills the frog eventually sometimes, or it prevents them from breeding. We see a lot of instances where these pollutants can turn male frogs into females, and sometimes female frogs into males. So it alters their organs and their reproduction and everything. So it really causes some big issues with the pollutants getting in the water, even if it doesn't directly kill these frogs and salamanders. Okay, so keep the questions going. We're going to talk a bit about global climate change next. And this is really unique in the sense that we know that the climate is changing. We know that it's caused by humans. And we're starting to see some really big changes in amphibian populations. And right now, there isn't this really um, big link with amphibians declining, meaning, populations declining or going extinct with climate change. So that we're sure that that's a big concern. And we think that for some species it might already be occurring, but there hasn't been a whole lot of evidence to suggest that the climate is warm enough now, that the change is fast enough right now, that these animals are undergoing extinctions from it. What it is it's more of a prediction that we are really concerned that if the climate continues to warm, meaning if humans don't kind of really put a stop to what we're doing to make it warm, then we think that these frogs and salamanders and other amphibians are going to be impacted by climate change a lot more. What we are seeing now is that a couple things are happening. We know there's been several studies that showed the phenology of frogs and salamanders are changing with climate change. And basically what that means is just the timing of when they're doing things. So a lot of these frogs, salamanders, amphibians in the North America, where I live in Illinois, they are really dormant during the winter time. So they either brumate or some of them kind of just totally freeze. And once it warms up, they wake up and they have these kind of different timings of when they're going to breed. They're going to lay their eggs in water, they're going to lay their eggs land. And there's a certain timing to this that scientists have been studying for decades, where we know when certain species are going to breed and when others are going to breed. And it's all based on how this climate changes. So what we're seeing now is that, again, as these seasons start to lengthen out and winters become shorter and summers become warmer, we're starting to see that it's changing when these amphibians are doing things, when they're reproducing, when they're coming up. So we're seeing changes like that. The other thing that we're really worried about is that the climate is going to change so much that it will make some areas where frogs and salamanders and other amphibians live not suitable for them to live. It'll basically be too warm for them to live there. So what we're seeing here on the right are these two maps, and this is the Midwest United States. I live in Illinois, in that northeast part of Illinois. And this is a really cool study that one of my graduate students did, where he took these maps and he mapped out where all these amphibians were in the Midwest. And then he actually was able to build maps that would say, if the climate is like this is where all these species can live. And then he was able to project in the future by saying, well, if the climate changes because of global climate change, what are the distributions of these amphibians going to be? So as the climate changes, where these amphibians can live then changes. And what he was able to do was combine all this together and say, well, where are these amphibians going to be in the future? And what he showed with these maps is that all these blue areas are areas where there aren't going to be a lot of predicted places that amphibians can live if the climate warms up. So if the climate warms, then it'll basically it'll be too warm or too different for a lot of these amphibian species in the Midwest. And what Brock was able to do was look at this based on how much we think the climate is going to change based from global climate change. So what you're seeing on the left there is that if we really stop doing the things that are warming up the climate, then we will see a lot less change in where these animals can live than if we don't do as much and the climate warms more and more and changes more and more. Then we'll see that there's a lot more blue areas, the red areas where there's predicted to be a lot of species is smaller. So we're seeing that across the landscape, there's this really big way that we think the climate might change enough where it could alter where these animals live. And really that boils down to their physiology. Really, it's just they are adapted and they've lived for so long in these certain environments that are cool and moist, or have water in certain times of the year. And if you change that, then you basically just change where these animals can live. It's almost like you just cut down the forest that they're living in. They won't be able to physically live in these environments if it's too warm. And that's what Brock's maps are showing, is that if we continue to go down this path and the climate changes more and more, then we'll see that the declines of amphibians will probably be a lot worse than it is today even. So we have a few more questions here. Let's get to these. Okay, so this one here is water the only source of pollution amphibians are exposed to? And the answer there is actually no. There are a lot of exposure in forests that amphibians get pollutants by. And that just happens to be just what humans are doing. You know, humans can impact the environment a lot of ways, and it's not just that we, you know, use pesticides on crops and that drains into water, but we can use pesticides in forest. You know, we can change the structure of forest, and we can, you know, have forests next to areas that are urbanized, and all these can input pollutants in both the land and the water. And if they're in either of those, then they're impacting some amphibian species, because amphibian species usually live in both of these types of habitats. If they're biphasic, they live in the land and the water. So if the land or the water is polluted in any way, then amphibians will get exposed to it. Okay. So another question here is it possible to have nuclear radiation inside a frog and transfer that to humans? And I don't think that's really possible unless the frog gets exposed to some sort of radiation that doesn't kill it, and the human eats that frog. Then they can actually transfer that radiation to the frog if it built up into its tissue, for sure. The last question here so far is, I've seen a decline in amphibians like frogs in my area. What can I do to help the population rebound? That's a great question. And the shortest answer is just to provide as much habitat for those animals as you can. And that could be as simple as creating a pond in your backyard. And it doesn't need to be a very big pond even. You can dig a hole and put a cardboard box and fill that up with water, and that sometimes can provide habitat for amphibians. Even just piles of wood and piles of leaves in certain areas can provide habitats for amphibians. So you could do something that small and really still make a big impact on these amphibian species. The other thing you can do, I think, is to look at what area you're in and how it's managed by people. You know, so for instance, if you're in an area that's really rural and maybe there's a lot of, you know, agriculture there, then you can start looking at ways that you might be able to reduce the pollutants that go into that environment. Or you might be able to more broadly, you know, make advancements in putting habitat there. So you might try to get a farmer to put a wetland on their property, or build a forest, or, you know, try to grow some trees around. So really those things can have a really big impact on amphibian populations. And then the other thing I would say is just, you know, once they're there, all you really have to do is leave them alone. I think they're really resilient animals for the most part. And if you provide that habitat and you leave them alone, then they generally can rebound their populations pretty well themselves. Okay, so we have another question here, which is, how do amphibians contribute to forest ecosystems? And that's a really good question. And it's something that my lab actually studies quite a bit, and that we know a little bit about. So it depends on the amphibian and what it's like and what it does. But in general, here's probably the best answer to that is, when you look at, let's say, a forest or a wetland that has a lot of amphibians, they can do a couple things. Just the fact that there's a lot of these animals around can actually provide a really big food resource. So amphibians and reptiles are generally, you know, really abundant. So there's a lot of them. And when you look at amphibians, there's tons and tons of them in a lot of areas, and they're pretty small. They're mostly meat, so they provide a lot of food for animals. So they're a big base of the food web, so to speak. We also see that when you look at these amphibians, since there's so many of them, they're not just providing food, but they're also eating a lot. Most amphibians are actually predators, so they eat a lot of bugs, and that is a basically another way they impact ecosystems, where they have this kind of top-down effect. There's so many of them that even though they're really small, they can eat a lot of bugs or they can eat a lot of plant material, and that can then have this kind of bottom down, this top down effect on the ecosystem. So they're providing food, they're eating a lot of things. And the third thing I would say is that, um, just to get graphic, amphibians still go to the bathroom. So as these amphibians are eating these bugs, they're going to the bathroom, and their waste is a different type of nutrient. So they're actually recycling nutrients a lot. So amphibians are taking something that's like organic in this bug, and it's converting it to something that is waste that plants can then use. So they can cycle a lot of nutrients, especially if you have a lot of amphibians in an area, then they can provide a lot of nutrients and they can cycle a lot of nutrients. So they have some pretty big impacts on ecosystems as far as we can tell. And again, it's kind of dependent on the species and how many there are, what type of ecosystem they're in. But the fact that there's so many of them, where there's good habitat, that really shows that they can have a lot of impacts, and just kind of depends on the system itself. Okay, so let's move on to talking about this impact of the pet trade and overexploitation. And this really comes down to two different ways that this impacts amphibians. The first of which is that a lot of times these animals are just collected for pets. And it doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but when you look at how many people keep amphibians as pets, and you look at some of the areas where they're collected for the pet trade, a lot of times they could be collected when they're endangered, or the populations are declining, when they're in trouble already. So any animals that you take out from the wild are, you're basically um, making that animal ecologically dead. There's no way it can go back and reproduce and keep the population going. So when you take animals out from the wild and you start, basically selling them to people as pets, then that alone, when it happens a lot, it can actually reduce the population in some of these amphibians. The second way is that in a lot of areas, particularly in Asia, amphibians are a very big food resource. And there's a lot of them generally, and they're pretty easy to catch. And this historically wasn't that big of a deal, but as the human population has increased on Earth over and over and over, then more and more people are eating, more and more amphibians, and in combination with collecting them for, the pet trade, they're also being exploited, where too many of them are being taken out of the wild for food resources. So this kind of general collection of these animals from the wild for these two reasons is really leading to a lot of declines in amphibians in some areas as well. What we also see is that oftentimes, collecting these animals and, keeping them in close quarters, and then some of them can escape, it can actually breed and then transmit a lot of these diseases that are pretty bad in nature. So it actually kind of further enhances that impact of diseases, because when we're collecting them, we're helping to spread these diseases in areas that, maybe some of these animals wouldn't be. So if you're taking a salamander from China and you're shipping it over to the US to be someone's pet, they release it into a wetland, whatever parasites or diseases that salamander from China has are now in the United States. So you're kind of providing these opportunities for these these diseases and parasites to get transferred around as well. Okay, so we have another question here, which is, if amphibians went extinct today, how would it affect humans? And that's a really interesting question. And I think the best answer is that since since amphibians have such a integral part in a lot of food webs, then what we think is that it could go a couple different ways. You know, amphibians make up a lot of food for organisms, like I mentioned, and they have some impacts on nutrient recycling and, you know, kind of eating different insects. So I'm not sure if we exactly know, you know, how humans would be impacted directly, but some of the things that we hypothesize is that it could actually change a lot of the insects that are around. So amphibians eat a lot of insects, especially amphibians that live in wetlands. And there's been some evidence to show that the amount of amphibians that eat all these insects can actually reduce populations of insects that we don't want around. So if amphibians weren't around, we think that it might change what insect populations are around and how they kind of act. And if you think about it the other way, just amphibians as being food themselves, we think that losing these amphibians might actually lead to the decline of organisms that eat them as well. And then if you broaden that out even more, then you're looking at not just the kind of base of the food web in terms of insects being impacted, but if insects change, then the plants will likely change. And then if the organisms that eat amphibians change, then that could really change a lot of things. So everything's really connected in the natural world. And if you remove something like amphibians that are really abundant and diverse and have been in these ecosystems a long, long, long time, then that's why we're really not quite sure how it will impact humans. But those are the ways that we think it might, is that they might change the insect populations, it might change organisms that eat them directly, and that could lead to a lot of changes that you know, could impact humans pretty directly. Okay, keep those questions going. We have just a few minutes left. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is stuff that we already kind of mentioned a bit, which is, what do amphibians do for the environment? And since we only have a few minutes, I'll kind of go through this, especially since we talked about this a bit. Again, amphibians are really good food for animals. We know that they're important for ecosystems. So this is what I was talking about, where this amphibian can eat these bugs. It uses what it needs, and then it poops out the rest. And what it's pooping out is actually really good nutrients for the ecosystem. So it can cycle nutrients, you know, pretty well in the environment. We also see that amphibians are starting to become really cool to study for human medicine. So like someone asked, they can regenerate limbs. We see that these toxic frogs actually have cool compounds in them that help a lot with creating medicines for humans. So they have these other impacts as well that are really understudied. Okay, so we just have a minute or so left. So if you have any other questions, let me know, and I can try to answer them the best I can. It was really great talking to everyone, and I'm happy I got to meet you and answer your questions. Remember, no animals as pets from the wild, and try your best to create habitats for these amphibians. Okay, everyone, I think my time's almost up, so please give a round of applause to the National Biodiversity Teach-In organizers. They're doing a great job. It's really fun, and I hope you enjoy all the rest of the talks as well.